She thought she was falling in love with a broke man who drove a dented pickup truck, worked a 9 to 5 fixing HVAC units, and could barely afford to take her out to dinner twice a month. She thought he was just a regular guy, a little rough around the edges, a little guarded, but real. The kind of real that is hard to find. The kind of real that women who have been hurt before stop believing exists. And for 8 months, she loved him exactly like that. Fully. Without reservation. Without conditions. She paid for groceries when he said he was short. She fixed his broken jacket zipper with a sewing kit her mother gave her. She told her daughter that this man, this quiet, unassuming man, might be the one. And then one Tuesday morning, on a completely ordinary day, her coworker dropped a magazine on her desk, pointed to a photograph on the cover, and said, "Isn't that your boyfriend?" And the world she thought she understood cracked straight down the middle. Because the man in that photograph, standing at the entrance of a glass tower in downtown Nashville, wearing a suit that cost more than her car, was named James Calloway. And James Calloway was worth $2.4 billion. Now before we go any further, I want you to stay with me, because this story is not the story you think it is. It is easy, at first, to look at what James Calloway did and call it a lie. It is easy to call it manipulation. It is easy to close the door on him before you hear why he walked through it. But if you give this story the attention it deserves, if you sit with every single layer of it, you are going to find yourself asking a question that is much harder to answer than you expected. Not was what he did wrong, but what kind of pain turns a man into someone who cannot believe he is loved unless he earns it as a nobody? That is the real question at the center of this story. Who is James Calloway? What happened to him that was so devastating, so quietly destructive, that he spent months living as a different person just to feel something genuine? And the woman at the center of all of this, a 39-year-old nurse named Sandra Mitchell, a woman who had rebuilt her life from nothing and was not looking for anyone. What did she do when she found out the truth? What would you have done? Before we go deeper into the story, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and let us know where in the world you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us go back to the beginning. James Calloway was born in 1978 in Clarksville, Tennessee, the second of 3 boys, in a house where the hot water worked about 2/3 of the time and the kitchen table had one leg shorter than the others, so it always tilted slightly to the left. His father, Raymond Calloway, was a union electrician who worked long hours and came home tired in a way that went bone deep, the kind of tired that does not go away with a good night's sleep. His mother, Diane, cleaned houses on the other side of town, the kind of houses where the driveways were longer than some streets in their neighborhood. James understood very early what it meant to not have enough. He understood it not as an abstract concept but as a physical feeling, a tightening in the chest when the school year started and new shoes were not in the budget, a specific kind of shame that children carry but do not have the language to explain. He was not a bitter child, though. He was observant. He watched everything. He watched how the men who owned the houses where his mother worked moved through the world with a looseness in their shoulders, a confidence that seemed to come not from what they knew or who they were but simply from the fact that they never had to worry. And James decided, somewhere around the age of 12, sitting on the front steps of that tilted table house in Clarksville, that he was going to build something. He did not know what. He did not know how. He just knew that the version of the world where he was powerless was not the only version available to him. He graduated high school with decent grades, not spectacular, and got a partial scholarship to Middle Tennessee State University. He paid the rest with weekend shifts at a warehouse and a summer job doing landscaping that left his hands rough and his back sore by Sunday nights. He studied business not because it excited him but because he understood it was the language that separated the people at the table from the people waiting outside the door. And during his junior year, he started a small company with a friend, a logistics software company that solved a narrow but persistent problem in the regional trucking industry. Within 4 years, it was generating real revenue. Within 6, a private equity firm in Atlanta made an offer. James was 31 years old when he signed that deal. The number on the check had more zeros than anything his father had ever seen in his life. Raymond Calloway cried at the kitchen table when James told him. Not from happiness, though there was happiness in it. He cried because he recognized in his son's success everything he had worked toward and never quite reached. And there is a particular kind of love that lives in that moment between a father and a son when the son finally clears the wall the father always ran into. James never forgot that kitchen. He never forgot that table with the short leg. And no matter how large the empire he went on to build, the technology firm, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolio that would eventually place him on the Tennessee Business Journal's list of the state's wealthiest individuals, he carried Clarksville with him like a stone in his chest. A reminder, compass, but also, as it would turn out, a wound. Here is something that nobody tells you about becoming wealthy when you started with nothing. The money does not just change your address and your car. It changes how people look at you. It changes the temperature of every room you walk into. And when it comes to love, when it comes to the most vulnerable, unguarded parts of a man's life, T does something particularly cruel. It makes every gesture of affection feel like a question. Because now you are always left wondering, is she here for me or for this? James Calloway met a woman named Victoria in 2013. He was 35. She was 32. She was brilliant, well-traveled, the kind of woman who could talk about anything and make you feel like you were the most interesting person she had ever met. They dated for 2 years. He fell deeply in love with her in a way that surprised him, because James had always been guarded, always compartmentalized, always protected the private version of himself behind the public one. But Victoria got through, or at least he believed she did. They were engaged for 11 months. The wedding was planned. The venue was booked. The invitations had gone out. And then, 3 weeks before the ceremony, James found a series of messages on Victoria's laptop, messages she had left open by accident, or maybe not entirely by accident, because sometimes people who are tired of carrying a secret find ways to let it spill. The messages were between Victoria and a friend of hers. They painted a picture that took James several hours to fully absorb. A picture in which Victoria had stayed in the relationship not because of who James was but because of the security his world represented. In which she had calculated, quite deliberately and over a sustained period of time, the value of attaching her future to his. In which his love for her was never the point. It was the mechanism. The messages were not cruel in tone. That was almost the worst part. They were pragmatic, matter of fact, the way you might discuss a business arrangement with a trusted colleague. James called off the engagement. He told almost no one why. He did not make a scene. He did not confront her publicly. He simply withdrew with the same quiet discipline he had used to build everything else, and he did not speak of it for a long time. But it rewired something in him. It changed the internal architecture of how he approached love, how he processed intimacy, how he evaluated the intentions of anyone who got close. He was not broken exactly, but he was altered. And the version of James Calloway that emerged from that experience carried a question like a splinter under the skin, one that would not let him rest, one that would eventually drive him to do something that most people, hearing it from the outside, would call either the most romantic thing they had ever heard or the most reckless. It was the spring of 2019 when James Calloway made the decision. He was 40 years old. He had spent the 6 years since Victoria building relentlessly, insulating himself in work the way some men insulate themselves in whiskey, using the thing that numbed the ache as the same thing that defined his identity. His company, Calloway Integrated Systems, now employed over 3,000 people across 4 states. His personal net worth had crossed $2 billion. He had everything. And he had never felt more alone in the specific way that only a man who has been genuinely deceived by someone he loved can feel alone. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of not knowing whether the warmth people showed him was real or performed. He had his lawyer, a sharp and deeply loyal man named Tom Greer, who had been with James since the early days and had watched the Victoria situation play out in all its quiet devastation. It was Tom who James called on a Wednesday night in April. And what James told him over the next 2 hours was this: he wanted to build a second life. A temporary, constructed, deliberate second life. He wanted to rent an apartment under a different last name, James Cole, a name ordinary enough to disappear into any neighborhood. He wanted a job that was credible but modest. He settled on HVAC technician because it was skilled labor, it was respectable, and it came with enough technical vocabulary that he could hold the cover if anyone pressed. He had done enough renovation work on his own properties over the years to know the language. He wanted no luxury signals, no designer clothes, no expensive car. A used 2014 Ford F-150 that he paid cash for at a lot outside Nashville. A prepaid phone. A modest checking account with a regular balance. Tom Greer listened to the entire plan without interrupting. Then he said, "James, I have to tell you something as your lawyer, and as someone who genuinely cares about what happens to you." James said, "Go ahead." Tom said, "This is either going to be the most clarifying thing you have ever done, or the most devastating. And right now, I cannot tell you which." James said, "Neither can I, but I have to find out." He was not looking for just any woman. He was not going to run an experiment on the first person he met. He had thought about this carefully. He was looking for a woman who had nothing to gain from his money. A woman who existed entirely outside the world he lived in. A woman whose life had already been shaped by real difficulty, so that she would not be dazzled by comfort she had never known, but would recognize it for exactly what it was. He was looking for someone who would love James Cole, the HVAC technician. Because if that was possible, if something real could grow in that ordinary soil, then he would finally have his answer. And on a Saturday morning in September of 2019, in the plumbing aisle of a Home Depot on the south side of Nashville, James Calloway met Sandra Mitchell. Sandra Mitchell was 37 years old when she walked into that Home Depot. She was not there for anything romantic. She was there because the weather stripping on her back door had finally given out and the Tennessee autumn was starting to push cold air through the gap at the bottom. And Sandra Mitchell was not the kind of woman who waited around for someone else to fix things. She had been doing things herself for a long time. She had grown up in Murfreesboro, about 30 miles southeast of Nashville, the middle daughter of a schoolteacher and a postal worker. Her childhood was not rich, but it was full of something better than money. It was full of the kind of quiet dignity that working-class parents pass to their children without ever naming it. The understanding that your word is worth more than your wallet, that the way you treat people when there is nothing in it for you is the only measure of character that matters. Sandra had married young. She was 24 when she married a man named Derek, and she had gone into that marriage with everything she had, completely the way certain people love, without reservation, without calculation, without a plan B. Derek was not a bad man. But he was a weak one in the particular way that is sometimes harder to recover from than outright cruelty, because weakness masquerades as kindness right up until the moment it cannot anymore, and by then you have built your whole life around someone who was never capable of holding it up. They separated when Sandra was 32 and their daughter, Kayla, was 7 years old. The divorce took 18 months and cost Sandra more in emotional currency than she had thought she possessed. But she got through it the way she got through everything, by deciding, somewhere in the rubble of what had ended, that her daughter was watching her, and that what Kayla needed to see was not a mother who collapsed, but a mother who rebuilt. Sandra went back to school at 34. She finished her nursing degree at 36. She worked nights at a hospital in Nashville, drove Kayla to school in the mornings, slept in the afternoon, and refused, absolutely refused, to let the hardness of her life make her hard. By the time she walked into that Home Depot on that September Saturday, Sandra Mitchell was a woman who had earned every single thing she had. She was not looking for love. She had quietly decided that the version of her life where love worked was probably behind her, and that this was okay because she had Kayla and she had her work, and she had the particular peace that comes to people who have stopped needing to be rescued and started being quietly proud of the fact that they never needed rescuing in the first place. She was standing in the aisle looking at 2 different packages of weather stripping, holding them up, comparing the thickness, when a man beside her said, "I would go with the foam-backed rubber. Vinyl looks better on the package, but it does not seal as well when the temperature really drops." She looked at him. He was tall, dark-haired, a little older than she had expected from the casual confidence of the voice. He was wearing a plain gray t-shirt and jeans. No jewelry, nothing that announced itself. His hands looked like he worked with them, and his eyes, when she met them, were the eyes of someone who had known difficulty and had not run from it. She said, "How do you know?" He said, "I've put it on enough doors that I stopped making the mistake." She bought the foam-backed rubber, and at the checkout line, completely by accident, or completely by design depending on how you understand the way certain moments arrive in a life, they ended up next to each other again. She said thank you. He said anytime. She almost walked to her car. Almost. Sandra almost did not give him her number. She told her sister this later, in a phone call that lasted 2 hours and covered everything. She said she almost walked away because she had been cautious for years, deliberately cautious, and something about James Cole felt like a risk she was not sure she had the reserves for. But he did not press. He did not perform. He was standing there at the checkout line in that ordinary gray t-shirt, and he said something about the weather stripping problem being universal, and they both laughed, and it was just real. It had the weight of something real. So, she gave him her number. And that decision changed everything. Their first date was a Tuesday evening at a barbecue place on Charlotte Avenue in Nashville. Plastic trays, folding chairs, iced tea in paper cups. James Cole paid with cash, $18, and left a $4 tip that Sandra noticed because she had spent enough years on her feet at work to know exactly what a decent tip meant from a man who did not have a lot. They talked for 3 hours. Not about impressive things. About Tennessee winters. About what it was like to grow up in a house where money was always the third person at the table. About what their fathers had taught them without meaning to. About the particular exhaustion of building something from nothing and discovering that the building never really stops. Sandra talked about Kayla. James listened in the careful way that people listen when they actually want to know. Not to respond. Not to be charming. Just to know. He asked her what Kayla liked. Sandra said dinosaurs and basketball and mystery novels that were too old for her. James smiled, not the smile of a man trying to win something, but the smile of a man who is genuinely delighted by a piece of information, and Sandra noticed the difference. She had been around enough men who performed warmth to recognize warmth that was not performed. They saw each other again the following Friday, and the Friday after that, and within 6 weeks of that Home Depot parking lot, something was happening between Sandra Mitchell and James Cole that neither of them had budgeted for. James was living in the rented apartment in East Nashville under the James Cole identity with a discipline that was costing him more than he had anticipated, not logistically but psychologically. Because the problem with building something genuine on a false foundation is that the more genuine it becomes, the heavier the foundation feels. He had planned this as a finite experiment, a calibration, a way of proving something to himself and then returning to his real life. But Sandra Mitchell was not cooperating with the plan. She was not a test subject who was giving him data. She was a person, a fully formed, complicated, beautiful, difficult, funny, stubborn, completely real person. And somewhere around week 7, sitting on her couch at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night eating reheated lasagna and watching a documentary they had both seen before, James Calloway understood that he was not running an experiment anymore. He was falling in love. Here is the thing about a lie that starts with good intentions. It does not stay the size you designed it to be. It grows in proportion to the thing it is protecting, and the more valuable the thing becomes, the bigger the lie has to get to cover it. By month 4, James was managing 2 complete lives with the precision of someone running parallel operations, because in a very real sense, that was exactly what he was doing. His actual life, the James Calloway life, involved a company with 3,000 employees, a board that needed him present, real estate deals in 3 states, and a schedule so dense that his assistant had to block out time for him to eat lunch. His James Cole life involved Sandra's backdoor weather stripping, Kayla's basketball games on Saturday mornings, neighborhood barbecues in East Nashville, and the specific cadence of a relationship that was building itself from the ground up with no scaffolding other than 2 people who kept choosing each other. The logistics of maintaining the cover were staggering. His COO, a man named Marcus Webb who had been with the company since year 3, was the only person at Calloway Integrated Systems who knew what James was doing. Marcus kept the schedule coordinated. He rerouted calls. He covered appearances. He was loyal in the way that people are loyal when they have watched someone build something real from nothing and have decided that the person is worth protecting. But even Marcus had told James, for months in, that this was getting complicated in ways that were going to be very difficult to unwind. James knew it. He could feel it in the way you feel a tooth beginning to ache before it becomes a problem, that low, persistent signal that something needs attention before it becomes a crisis. The first close call came in December. For months into the relationship, Sandra's car broke down on I-40, a Tuesday night, at 9:30, In the rain. She called James. The James Cole James. He was in a dinner meeting at a restaurant in downtown Nashville where James Calloway was expected to be, where several people who knew his actual face were sitting 30 feet away. He excused himself from the table, told Marcus to hold things, drove out to I-40 in a car he had specifically kept for the Cole identity, and stood on the shoulder of the highway in the rain for 2 hours while they waited for a tow truck. Sandra huddled against his shoulder in a windbreaker she had grabbed from her back seat, and she kept apologizing for the inconvenience, and he kept telling her there was nowhere else he would rather be, and the thing was, the maddening, clarifying, terrifying thing, he meant it completely. He stood on that highway shoulder in the rain, missing a dinner that probably involved several $1 million worth of conversation, and he was exactly where he wanted to be. But on the drive back to her apartment, in the quiet of the cab, with Sandra's head leaning against the window and her eyes half closed from exhaustion, James sat with the weight of what he was doing, and it had never felt heavier. Sandra Mitchell was not a woman who said things she did not mean. That was important to understand. She had lived long enough, survived enough, to know that words carry weight and that the weight compounds when they are spoken into the wrong ears. She had not told a man she loved him since Derek. Not once. Not even close. She had closed that door carefully when the divorce was finalized, and she had not tested it since. Because some doors you keep closed not out of bitterness but out of self-preservation, out of the understanding that what lives behind them has the power to undo you, and you are only now getting yourself together. So when Sandra said it for the first time on a Friday night in February, in the small kitchen of the East Nashville apartment James had rented for the Cole identity, while he was washing dishes and she was sitting on the counter watching him and they were talking about nothing consequential, the way people do when they are so comfortable with each other that silence and small talk have become indistinguishable, when she said it then, James went completely still. He stood at the sink with his hands in the water and he did not move for several seconds. And she said, a little softer, James. And he turned around. And the look on his face was not the look of a man being told what he wanted to hear. It was the look of a man being handed something that he desperately wanted and was not sure he had the right to take. He said it back. He said it looking her directly in the eyes, and every syllable of it was true, and that truth was the most excruciating part. Because James Calloway was standing in a kitchen he had rented under a false name, in jeans he had bought deliberately worn, telling a woman he loved her, and meaning every word of it in the deepest and most unambiguous sense. And the name she knew him by was not his name, and the life she believed she was stepping into was not the life that existed. He called Tom Greer that night. At midnight, Tom had long since stopped being surprised by late calls from James. He listened. Then he said, James, you have to tell her, and you have to do it before she finds out another way. Because there is no version of her finding out another way that ends well. James said he knew that. Tom said, when? James said, I just need a little more time. Tom said, you are out of time. You just have not admitted it yet. The Tennessee Business Journal ran a feature in March. James Calloway had known about it. He had, in fact, authorized the interview 4 months earlier when the cover story was still months away and his personal life was a different shape than it was now. The story ran on a Thursday. It was a full profile, the Clarksville origin story, the logistics software company, the private equity deal, the expansion into real estate and technology investment, the net worth figures confirmed in print for the first time. There was a photograph on the cover. James in a charcoal suit, standing at the entrance of the Calloway building in downtown Nashville, squinting slightly against the morning light. He looked exactly like who he was. A woman named Deborah, who worked the front desk at the hospital where Sandra worked nights, saw the magazine at a coffee shop that Thursday morning. She had met James Cole twice, once when he picked Sandra up from a shift and they had exchanged pleasantries in the parking lot, and once at a fundraiser Sandra had dragged him to in January. Deborah looked at the cover. She looked at it for a long time. And that afternoon she set it on Sandra's locker with a post-it note that said, "Is this James?" Sandra saw it at the beginning of her shift. She stood at her locker for a very long time. The first thing she felt was not anger. It was a cold, spreading disorientation, the specific feeling of a floor you have trusted completely shifting under your feet. Because the man on that cover had James's jaw and James's eyes and the exact tilt of James's head when he was thinking hard about something, and the name under the photograph was James Calloway, and the number next to his name had 9 zeros. She did not call him. She put the magazine in her bag and she worked her entire shift. 8 hours. She gave medications. She checked vitals. She talked to patients. She did everything her job asked of her with the same steady competence she always brought to it. And for 8 hours she kept the question locked in a part of herself she had learned to seal off, the part where the things that could undo her lived until she had the space to face them. She got home at 7 in the morning. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee she did not drink. And she opened her laptop and typed the name James Calloway into the search bar. What came back was not a small amount of information. The internet did not spare Sandra Mitchell anything. There was the Business Journal cover story. There were board announcements from Callaway Integrated Systems naming him as chairman and CEO. There were photographs from charity galas, James in formal attire, surrounded by Nashville's wealthiest philanthropists, looking entirely at ease in a world that she had never once imagined him inhabiting. There was a brief mention of a broken engagement from 2015, no details, just the social page noting that James Calloway and his former fiancée Victoria Hartwell had ended their engagement and would be making no further statement. There was a profile from 2017 that called him intensely private, that called him guarded, that quoted colleagues who said his personal life was completely sealed off from his professional one, and that people who had worked alongside him for years felt they knew the shape of him but not the interior. Sandra read all of it. Took her about 45 minutes. And then she sat with her untouched coffee and the morning light coming through the window, and she tried to assemble a picture that made sense. Because the man she was reading about and the man who had stood on the shoulder of I-40 in the rain with her for 2 hours were the same man. And the James she knew, the James who listened when she talked about Kayla, who ate leftover lasagna on her couch, who fixed things with his hands and laughed too loud at his own jokes and got quiet in a way that was never cold but always thoughtful, that James was real. She knew the difference between performance and authenticity because she had lived with performance for 8 years in a marriage that taught her, painfully, exactly what the gap between the two felt like. What she had with James Cole was not performed. It was the most unperformed thing she had experienced in her adult life. And that was the thing she could not reconcile. Because you cannot lie to someone with the truth. And everything James had shown her about who he was, his patience, his warmth, his attentiveness, his willingness to stand in the rain, none of that was a lie. But the frame around it, the name, the job, the apartment, the entire context of his life, all of it was constructed. She put her coffee mug in the sink. She went to wake Kayla for school. She did not call James. She needed more time to decide what she was going to say before she said it. James knew something was wrong by Friday afternoon. Sandra had gone quiet in the specific way that people go quiet when they are processing something significant, not withdrawn, not cold, just careful. The responses to his texts were shorter than usual. The warmth was still there but muted, like a lamp with the dimmer turned most of the way down. He called her Friday evening. She answered. She asked him, in a voice that was entirely steady, whether there was anything he wanted to tell her. He knew. He had known it was coming. He had been running the scenario in his mind for weeks. But knowing a thing is coming and standing in the middle of it are entirely different experiences. And when Sandra's voice came through the phone, calm, waiting, giving him the dignity of a choice, he felt the weight of the 8 months they had spent building something together pressed down on every single word he was about to say. He said, "Yes, I think I should tell you in person." She said, "I think so too." He drove to her apartment. It was a 20-minute drive from the Callaway building where he had been when she called. He sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes before he went up. He knocked. She opened the door. She did not look surprised. She did not look furious. She looked the way people look when they have already done their grief in private and are now standing in the aftermath, clear-eyed, composed, waiting for the story to be completed. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where they had eaten hundreds of meals, where Kayla had done homework, where Sandra had sat with her untouched coffee, and he told her everything. He told her about Victoria. He told her about the engagement and the messages and what they had done to his ability to trust. He told her about the plan, the apartment, the truck, the James Cole identity. He told her about Tom Greer's warning. He told her about the moment on I-40 when he understood that the experiment had become a life. He told her about the February night in the kitchen when she said she loved him and he had stood at the sink unable to move because the most real thing he had ever felt was built on the most false foundation he had ever constructed, and he had not known what to do with that contradiction except to hold it and be terrified by it. He talked for over an hour. She did not interrupt him once. When he was finished, there was a silence in the kitchen that had the quality of a room after a great deal of sound has just stopped. Then Sandra said the thing that James Calloway would remember for the rest of his life. She said, "Did you ever trust me enough to just let me know you? Did you ever trust me enough to just let me know you?" James sat with that question at her kitchen table and he could not answer it. Because the answer, if he was honest, and he was finally completely honest, was no. He had never trusted her enough. He had trusted the version of her that he was observing from behind glass. He had trusted the results of the experiment. But he had never trusted Sandra Mitchell herself, had never looked at her, at this woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing, who had raised a daughter alone with grace and humor and absolute refusal to be diminished, who had given him more genuine warmth than anyone since his mother, and decided that she was someone he could hand the real version of himself to without armor. He had been so consumed with building a test that could give him certainty that he had never made the more terrifying and more human choice, which is to love someone without certainty. To decide that the risk was worth taking not because you had gathered enough evidence, but because some things cannot be proven and must instead be chosen. He said, "No, I never trusted you enough. And I am sorry." Sandra was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I need you to leave." He stood up. He did not argue. He said, "I understand." He said, "I know I don't deserve anything from you. But everything I felt, everything I showed you was real. Whatever name it was attached to, it was real." She did not respond to that. She opened the door. He walked out, and James Calloway, for the first time in years, felt the full force of having made a choice that could not be undone. He had found exactly what he was looking for, and in finding it the way he had found it, he had done precisely the thing he was most afraid of doing. He had lost it. James Calloway did not contact Sandra Mitchell for 22 days. This was not easy for him. It was one of the most difficult things he had done, and that is not a small statement from a man who had built a $2 billion company from a partial scholarship and a warehouse job. Because everything in him, every instinct, every habit of control that had shaped his adult life wanted to act, wanted to call, wanted to explain further, to send something, to do something that demonstrated how seriously he took what he had broken. But Tom Greer, who had by now become less a lawyer and more the closest thing James had to a confessor, told him something on the night he drove away from Sandra's apartment. Tom said, "James, the only way you can honor her now is to leave the choice entirely in her hands. You have had the control in this situation from the beginning. You built the circumstances. You managed the information. For the first time, you have to give all of that up completely. She knows where you are. She knows everything now. The only thing left for you to do is wait." And so James waited. He returned to his actual life with a completeness that felt, after 8 months of the double existence, almost disorienting. He was in his office, in his apartment, at the board table, in the buildings and boardrooms and conversations that had defined him before Sandra. But they had a different quality now, slightly hollow, the way a room feels when something that gave it sound has been removed. He thought about Kayla. He thought about Sandra's kitchen table. He thought about the barbecue place on Charlotte Avenue and the iced tea in paper cups and 3 hours of conversation that did not need to try to be anything. He thought about what it had felt like to stand in the rain on I-40 and know with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he wanted to be. And he thought about the question she had asked him, the question he could not answer. "Did you ever trust me enough to just let me know you?" He sat with that question for 22 days. And on the 22nd day, at 6:47 in the evening, his phone rang. It was Sandra. He answered before the second ring was finished. She said, "I don't want to talk on the phone. Can you come over?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Come as yourself." He drove to East Nashville in his own car for the first time. The car that James Calloway drove, not the truck that James Cole kept in a lot off Dickerson Pike. He had not planned this to be a signal, but it was unavoidable. Everything was itself now. There was no constructed version of anything left to maintain. He knocked. There was a pause that lasted long enough that he became aware of his own heartbeat in a way he rarely was. Then the door opened. Sandra was in scrubs. She had just come off a shift. She looked tired in the way she always looked after nights, with a specific weariness around the eyes that she wore the way certain people wear their history, openly, without apology. She looked at him. He was in a regular button-down shirt and dark jeans, not a suit, but not the Cole costume either. Just himself. She stepped aside and let him in. Kayla was at a sleepover. The apartment was quiet. Sandra went to the kitchen and James followed, and they sat at the same table where he had confessed everything. She had a mug of tea. She did not offer him one. She said, "I've been thinking for 3 weeks about whether what you did was something I could understand." He waited. She said, "I think I understand why you did it. I've met people who were hurt so badly they could not figure out how to be in a relationship without building a wall around themselves first. I've been one of those people." She looked at her mug. "But James, and I mean James Calloway, not James Cole, because I need to start using the right name, what you did was not build a wall. You built a whole different room and invited me into it and told me it was your house." He said, "I know," she said. "And the worst part, the part that kept me up every single night for 3 weeks, is that inside that room, you showed me things that were completely true. Your kindness is real. Your history is real. The way you listen is real. The way you were with Kayla is real. None of that was constructed." She looked up at him. "But you took away my right to choose it freely. You took away my ability to say, knowing who you actually are, I want this." The room was quiet for a long time. Then Sandra said, "So I am here tonight because I want to give myself that choice, with full information, as the actual two people we are." James exhaled in a way that carried the weight of 22 days. He said, "Okay." She said, "Tell me who you are. Not from the beginning, I know the facts now. Tell me who you actually are." They talked until 2 in the morning. Not about the deception. Not about Victoria, not about the plan, not about the logistics of what he had built and maintained. They talked about James Calloway, the actual interior of him, the parts that had never been part of the James Cole cover because they were too specific, too revealing, too unguarded. He told her about his father at the kitchen table with the short leg. About the particular weight of a man who worked his whole life and still died before he got to rest. He told her about signing the deal at 31 and feeling, in the middle of the celebration, a grief he could not explain and still could not fully name, grief, maybe, for the version of his father who should have been there but was not, or grief for the boy in Clarksville who had spent so many years running toward something and was only now realizing he did not know what to do when he arrived. He told her about the empty quality of success that is not shared. About sitting in a 6,000-square-foot apartment in Nashville and feeling the silence of it in a way that no renovation or decoration had ever been able to fix. He told her about Victoria in more detail than he had told anyone except Tom. Not to ask for sympathy, but because Sandra had asked for the real version of him and Victoria was part of the real version. How the discovery of those messages had not just ended a relationship but had confirmed a fear he had been carrying since Clarksville. The fear that what he had built was the most interesting thing about him, and that without it he was just a man from Tennessee with rough hands and a tilted table in his history. Sandra listened. And then she said something that James Calloway would spend years turning over in his mind. She said, "You know the thing that broke my heart most? It wasn't the lie. It was that you needed a lie to find out something that I would have told you on the 3rd date if you'd asked. I didn't fall in love with a man who could fix my door or pay for dinner or protect me. I've protected myself my whole life. I fell in love with someone who stood in the rain with me on I-40 for 2 hours like it was the most natural thing in the world. That's who you are. You didn't need to build a character to show me that. You just needed to show up." Before we get to where James Calloway and Sandra Mitchell ended up, I want to stop here. Because this is the part of the story where the easy version, the romantic movie version, the version where love conquers all and the ending arrives with a swell of music, asks you to simply forgive the deception and move on to the happy part. But I do not think this story deserves an easy version. Because what James did touches something that lives in the lives of a lot of people watching this right now. How many of us have been so badly hurt by someone we trusted that we stopped being fully present in the next relationship? How many of us have held something back, not out of cruelty but out of self-protection, and in holding it back, taken something from the other person that was never ours to take? The right to be chosen freely. The right to know who you are actually loving. James Calloway had $2 billion and was still, in the most fundamental sense, running from a fear that no amount of money had ever addressed. The fear that if someone knew everything about him, not the Calloway building, not the net worth, not the cover of the business journal, but the boy with the rough hands and the tilted table, they might still choose to go. And Sandra Mitchell, who had rebuilt herself from the rubble of a marriage, who had been pouring everything into a daughter and a nursing degree and a life she had constructed board by board, was the last person in the world who needed someone else managing her access to the truth. She had earned her truth. All of it. And yet she sat at that kitchen table at 2 in the morning and she talked with a man who was genuinely, completely, irreversibly in love with her. And she made a choice. Sandra Mitchell did not make a decision on impulse. If you have followed this story carefully, you know that about her already. She took another 2 weeks after that 2 in the morning conversation. She talked to her sister. She talked to a therapist she had been seeing on and off since the divorce. She did not talk to Kayla about it because Kayla was 12 and this was not Kayla's weight to carry. But she watched her daughter over those 2 weeks, watched the way Kayla moved through the world with the quiet confidence of a girl who had grown up watching her mother refuse to be diminished, and something in that watching clarified things. Sandra called James on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after the kitchen conversation. She asked him to meet her somewhere public. He suggested the barbecue place on Charlotte Avenue. She said yes. They sat at a table in the back. Same plastic trays. Same iced tea in paper cups. Same folding chairs. The only difference was that this time, every single thing on the table between them was real. Sandra told James she had 2 conditions. The first was that there would never, in any circumstance, be another piece of information about his life that she did not have access to. Not because she needed to audit him, but because she needed to know, absolutely know, that the person across from her had chosen to be seen. The second condition was that he would have to be patient with her. That trust for Sandra was not an abstract principle. It was something she had built over years and lost once and rebuilt again, and it moved slowly and did not respond well to being rushed. James agreed to both conditions without hesitation. Sandra looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." James said, "Okay?" She said, "I'm not forgiving you all at once. This is going to take time. But I'm saying yes to finding out whether this is real when it's completely real." He said, "That's all I ever actually wanted." She said, "I know. That's the thing. I know." James Calloway and Sandra Mitchell dated for another 14 months before he asked her to marry him. He did not do it with a ring at a restaurant or a skywriter or any of the gestures available to a man with $2.4 billion. He did it at her kitchen table, on a Wednesday night, with Kayla in the next room doing homework. He had a ring, a simple one, not ostentatious, and he put it on the table between them and he said, "I want to do this right. I want to do everything from here right. And I want to do it as James Calloway, the man from Clarksville with the tilted table, not the cover of the business journal." Sandra looked at the ring for a long time. Then she looked at him. She said, "Kayla is going to have questions." He said, "I know. I'm ready for all of them." She picked up the ring. She said yes. The Tennessee Business Journal ran a small item about it 6 months later, noting that James Calloway, the CEO of Calloway Integrated Systems and one of Tennessee's most private public figures, had married in a small ceremony in Nashville. No further details were provided. Because some things are not for the public version of a life. Some things belong entirely to the kitchen table. Here is what I want to leave you with. This is not a story about a billionaire. It is not a story about money or deception or even, at its center, about romance. It is a story about what happens to a person when the thing they fear most is not failure but exposure. When they are afraid that if everything is stripped away, the title, the building, the number in the bank account, there might not be enough left to be loved. James Calloway had built an empire partly because building was the only thing that reliably told him he was enough. And it took a woman with rough nights and a nursing degree and a 12-year-old daughter who liked dinosaurs and basketball to show him that the thing he had been looking for was never going to be found in what he built. It was going to be found in what he was willing to show. We are all, in some version of this story, constructing something. A version of ourselves we think is more lovable than the real one. A performance we have been running so long we have forgotten it is a performance. The question this story asks, the question I want you to sit with after the screen goes dark, is this: is there someone in your life right now who has only ever met the constructed version of you? And what would happen if you let them see the rest? If you made it all the way to the end of the story, thank you for being here. I genuinely mean that. Drop a comment and tell us what you thought about what Sandra decided, because people are split on this one, and I want to hear where you land. Hit that subscribe button because we have more stories coming that are going to stay with you long after you close the tab. And until next time, stay honest with the people who matter. Costs less than the alternative.